Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. A silent but potentially deadly update today coming out of the FIA with the Technical Directive 39, one of the key talking points of last season, being partially revoked today. This means that porpoising could become more of a phenomenon again. Now the FIA will not check for it every Grand Prix weekend as they have been doing up until this point. What does it mean for the competitive grid order of the teams, given that Ferrari were disproportionately badly affected when this came into place last year? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. So the Australian Grand Prix is coming up next weekend, and it'll be the first Grand Prix for some time in which part of TD39 will no longer be taking place, or no longer effectively be tested for by the stewards, which seemed to be a bit of a tiresome gig for them now the cars don't bounce anymore. However, by revoking this, will it have any unintended consequences? So just to explain everything that's going on, last year at the start of the 2022 season, rumours started to emerge that Red Bull and Ferrari were getting some advantage from their flexible floors. Now, they were not being measured in all the places along the length of the floor, and therefore it seemed that Red Bull and Ferrari were able to allow the floors to flex more than they were meant to at specific points where they weren't getting tested. This is kind of one of the ways around the rulings, where the rule says, okay, it can only flex or get degraded by a millimeter, but if they're only testing in position A and position B, then make sure it doesn't flex more in those positions, but the rest of it, do what you like type thing. Seemed like Ferrari and Red Bull took advantage of that, the other teams didn't, and the theory was that was what was giving those teams their advantage. Turned out when this came into effect, the Red Bull was barely affected at all, if not, it got even better to be honest, but the Ferrari was badly affected once they had to put a flexi floor on. So that was part of the technical directive, and that is still in place. They changed the rules where they test it now, so you can't get away with the flexible floor stuff any longer. That's no longer a conversation. The other point though, which was kind of led by Toto Wolff and Mercedes, was that the cars were bouncing too much. Hamilton, his spine was getting broken every other week. He wasn't a happy man. The cars were bouncing so much, and the idea was it was a safety concern for the teams. The teams were incentivized to run their car as low to the ground as possible to maximize performance from the underside, from the floor that you guys can see here, how it generates the downforce through these beautiful Venturi tunnels. But there was a trade-off between the teams searching for performance and the potential porpoising that resulted, which hurt the drivers. So Toto Wolff and others were pushing for the FIA to say, hey, you're effectively going to mandate the cars to be raised somewhat so that porpoising was not an effect. And that eventually did happen as the other part of the technical directive, where the cars would get tested on a week-by-week basis to see how much they were oscillating on the straights, and if they were oscillating too much, the teams would be forced to raise the right height of their car to limit the porpoising effect, which would hurt their own performance. But you know, of course, that was the trade-off that they were going for at the time. This is the part that has now been revoked from the technical directive, and it's not been done publicly. It's been taken away in private with really no transparency. This was leaked today by the Italian press. It's kind of funny how this works. I don't know what the FIA do during these kind of down periods, but they're making a change. It seems mainly because they feel like that element is now redundant. Whether it is or not, I suppose we'll have to see over the coming days when we get into Australia. So these were some of the discussions last year at how the Technical Directive 39 really hurt the F175, had big consequences for the aero in the setup. Largely, I think this was floor related, but it was in part potentially related to the other elements which were affected by the ride height and the porpoising effects that were enforced to be reduced by the TD. This might mean, because the Ferrari at the start of the season, even this season, still showed some effect of porpoising in Bahrain, certainly around some of the corners. There's now no rule against how little or much you have to porpoise. If you want your car to bounce around all over the shop, if somehow you can still extract performance like that, then you can do it. And I think last year in Australia, like down that kind of back curvy straight that there is, the Ferrari was bouncing a lot, but it was the quickest car on track. So if Ferrari have some way that the drivers can put up with the bouncing, be it it's actually still efficient aerodynamically, they can do that now. There's no restrictions against them doing so, as we'll see in a second. So the TD39 has now been repealed. The rule controlling the chassis oscillations due to anti-porpoising compliance, introduced halfway through last season. The technical correction was issued to the teams privately, not publicly for some reason, removing the AOM. This is a beautiful term, I believe, aerodynamic oscillation measurement metric, with the introduction of the new 2023 aero rules. The reasons are somewhat unclear, but people speculate that because the new rules have come in for 2023 that have raised the ride height of the car themselves. So last year, the teams were kind of said, look, this season, the rules are going to stay the same, but if you bounce too much, you're going to have to raise the ride height to stop it type thing. This year, they raised the ride height anyway to reduce the effect, or effectively trying to eliminate the effect across the board. And therefore, the theory goes that TD39 is now redundant. So this is what the article went on to say. And I thought it was funny how they poked some shots at the FIA here. In spite of the alleged transparency much heralded by Formula One, this rule was repealed in absolute silence. So the abolition of the notorious TD39 that has sparked so many discussions. So as we say, that AOM metric that came in at Spa has been revoked. And the idea is that due to the new aero rules, lifting of the floor, and also like the kind of side of the floor here, like we can see on the Red Bull, was raised by 15 millimeters. I think another part of it was raised by, or the rear diffuser was raised by 10 millimeters. So that was deemed to be enough to control the bouncing in a straight line and obviously reduce the impact of the floor as such. And I guess they've decided, oh, well, the cars don't bounce anymore. So it's basically a waste of our time to check whether they're bouncing every single week and just measure the oscillation to see if it's kind of above or within the parameters. But now that is officially gone, and it is a question, right, especially when we go to some of the more street tracks such as Baku, where the porpoising was massive last year, and of course even Australia, it's a street track as well technically, so you know there is some additional potential there for damage to be had for the drivers. And it does seem now that the teams are effectively free to, if they want to destroy the spines of their drivers, they can do so. Now I don't think Mercedes would, and I don't even know if they would be able to, right, because of the regulations that have raised the ride height of the floor automatically. If they lowered their car as much as they possibly could this season to the limit of where they can do it, which they may already be for some teams, they may not be, would they get porpoising back? If they do, but if they still extract more performance, they can now do that, right? Whereas previously that was outlawed. So if some team can potentially extract performance and also have porpoising at the same time, that's now fine. And Ferrari had that at the start of last season. Mercedes, their porpoising always slowed them down. Ferrari, it didn't always seem to be the case. And if the drivers are happy with it, they might be able to gain something back here. But the flexi rules are still in effect. The flexi floor rules still in effect. And Gianni De Kessa comments on this from the Ferrari perspective and says, you know, from his perspective, he doesn't really believe that this is going to have much effect. The 2023 rules will overcome the TD, so nothing changes from his opinion for Ferrari. But, you know, we don't really know fully what's happening at the moment. And, you know, there should be no performance impact on the teams. And we've had no teams come out and complain about this yet. But there is still the possibility of it at least slightly increasing the likelihood of porpoising returning, because teams are no longer going to be punished for it happening, which they were before after Toto Wolff and others said, hey, look, this is bad for our drivers. I believe even Gasly after Baku made a comment to the effect of the teams are on a compromise between hurting our actual drivers but maximizing performance. And maybe there's a world in which that kind of paradigm returns here from Australia and beyond. So definitely intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Who's this going to help? Who's this going to hurt? More than likely nothing in reality is going to change here, but sometimes things arrive that you think are going to change, things such as TD39 last year, thought it might affect Red Bull, didn't. Sometimes things arrive you think won't affect anything, but they actually do. So we'll see about that one. Whether that's enough to help Mercedes even get close to Red Bull this season is an entirely different question, and it's largely going to come down to development rather than this specific revocation, or if that's even a word, of TD39, or at least part of it, as we discussed. The other thing to mention before we close out the video here is on Helmut Marko and the AlphaTauri team. We've heard rumours for some time now that AlphaTauri, former Toro Rosso, might either be gone or sold or rebranded or moved from being Scuderia AlphaTauri in Italy over to the UK, nearby Milton Keynes with Red Bull. We don't exactly know 100% yet, but there have been some questions that whether the AlphaTauri branding will be changed. And as he says, the branding of AlphaTauri has been scaled back somewhat because only in a few countries where we race, AlphaTauri is actually sold. It's only about 3 or 4 countries. So I guess the theory would be rebranded away from AlphaTauri because I guess it's a clothing brand, right? But it's kind of high end and there's only a few countries where it's actually available. So it maybe doesn't make too much sense. Maybe a step towards them just straight up selling the brands. There have been some rumors, right? The Honda, if they want to get in for 2026, could just take over AlphaTauri and become the Honda Works team. That's a possibility. I would like to see it. So hopefully it happens. And speaking of Red Bull fashion brand related content, I thought this is kind of funny actually. That Max Verstappen is working on some sort of clothing line brand called Max One, but he's got into some issues with Nike, right? Because Nike is saying, well, hang on a second, we've got the Air Maxes, Air Max Ones, whatever, and they're like, yeah, we own no copyright, so you can't have it type thing. So unlike Max, he's going to have to come up with another approach here, it seems. Probably didn't get the best advice on this one if he thought he was going to get away with that, but I'm sure it's very low down his list of priorities at the moment. And also just to close out the video, because Fernando Alonso would be again favourite to get a podium when we go to Australia next weekend, but the 101st podium of all the drivers that have achieved it so far have all been Grand Prix victories. Alain Prost in 1993, his 101st podium was a win. Same with Schumacher in 02, same with Hamilton in 16, same with Vettel in 18, and Raikkonen in 18, and now Alonso is the next driver to potentially get his 101st podium relatively soon, and will it be a win? People are already looking at the weather, of course, for the Australian Grand Prix and saying, well, it might rain, which might open the door, but we'll see. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.